Welcome back to Healing from Racism, Lessons from the Tao Te Ching video series. I'm Lisa Jagona, and in this video series, I'm using the passages of the Tao Te Ching to illuminate what racism is, where it begins, how we internalize it, and how we can find our way towards healing. And in this video, I'm going to be looking at verse 8, which is one of my favorites. So stick around, it is meaty, it is delicious, it's so good. So, it begins. The supreme good is like water, which nourishes all things without trying to. It is content with the low places that people disdain. Thus, it is like the Tao. I'll stop there to make one observation. And one of the patterns that I notice is how the narratives that create and uphold racism often seek to establish a type of monopoly on goodness, on beauty and power. But in verse 8, we see and are reminded that the supreme good, in fact, flows and is available to all things, to all beings, at all times. For the Tao is infinite. The monopolization of goodness is an illusion. This takes many forms, but one of the reoccurring ones happens in our origin stories. Thinking that only a small group of people have access to goodness and are the authority of goodness is simply out of harmony with how things truly are. Across the world, we have different traditions, we have different cultures, different faiths, and different spiritual practices. And the idea that a certain people or group of people are chosen and selected, many of that narrative repeats. And this narrative of a chosen people is one of my biggest critiques of organized religions, in part because I believe and see that same narrative being repeated in these narratives that really feed into hate. The idea that we are the people chosen simply doesn't hold water. Because when you look at and are curious enough to look into different traditions, you notice similar themes and ideas repeat, both positive and negative. Many spiritual practices and traditions have come to similar conclusions. And so the idea that only one group of people has the word just isn't so. And again, I see this idea of one chosen people being mirrored in the narratives that underpin racial hatred. Yes, some people and some organizations are really great at marketing. It comes down to that, really. Marketing and sales. They're able to market better, tell a better story, but they are not monopolists of goodness. Goodness is like water. It flows and nourishes all things and exists throughout all traditions. Continuing a little further down the verse, we are advised that in conflict, be fair and generous. Now this one's a tough one, especially when it comes to racism. But I think it's a very important one to have as a guidepost and to listen to and tune into, not just with your ears, but on a spiritual and radiance level. To be fair and generous in conflict. How different would your relationships be if you approached conflicts with this posture? Racism creates conflicts amongst people. We often approach each other seeking to blame and punish. Then we disengage. Our disengagement with each other creates more deprivation. The deprivation comes out of this inability to work our way through conflict. We separate and keep our distance from each other. But in the process, we're not just physically removing ourselves, we are also spiritually crippling ourselves. Because if we are all spiritual beings, what we're doing is severing our spirits. Again, this is a difficult one to put into practice, even with family members. But to be able to show up with fairness and generosity in conflict with family members, I think that would be a great place to start. When I work with people, in fact, I often start there, because if you cannot work your way through conflict and develop the ability to find resolution in conflict with your family members, people who are given to you, people whose history is your own, people whose story is deeply connected to your own, people whose future is somehow tied to you, people whose traumas likely and probably feed into your traumas and may even be the seed of your traumas today. If you aren't able to get to the point where you can show up in conflict and work through conflict with these people, it is a difficult journey to heal racism across divides with complete and total strangers. Some people who may actually say they don't like you simply because of the color of your skin. And so to be able to show up in conflict with fairness and generosity, the first and the best place to practice this is with family. As hard as that might be. And it's difficult because we bring so much history and so much hurt and so many disappointments, which are stacked. And so there's so much entanglement with family. But nevertheless, it is with family members that I would recommend that you practice to increase and strengthen your capacity to work through conflict with fairness and generosity to resolution. And I want to note, resolution doesn't mean that you agree with them. Rather, it's finding resolution within yourself through different ways of listening. You begin to see how and why it is this person experiences the world as they do, and accept that and accept them. And over time, you find your path towards forgiveness. Because when you can appreciate where someone is coming from, you more easily release the resentment and the bitterness and stop getting caught in their baiting. Understanding makes forgiveness possible. And I just want to give you a definition of what it means to forgive. To forgive means to stop feeling anger or resentment towards someone for an offense, flaw, or mistake. You stop feeling resentment, period. It doesn't mean that they did not offend. It doesn't mean that they don't have flaws anymore, but you stop feeling resentment because of their flaws. Instead, you reclaim your power to experience something more positive with them. Because that's also possible. Despite what traumas or what pain and what suffering and whatever delusions or limiting beliefs they might bring into the interactions and try to project onto you, do you know yourself enough to be able to show up willing to offer fairness and generosity, even when it might not be warranted? But again, if your own family isn't worthy enough for you to give them that courtesy, then it's going to be hard to heal from racism on a larger spectrum. So it starts there, because and I'm sure you do too, observe that from a historical perspective, the Black family has been under attack from racial systems. It is the separation of families. It is the inability to protect one's family. It is the inability to take care of your family. And more recently, the actual dropping of bombs and the dropping of guns and the dropping of drugs into families and communities. All of these things feed into the breaking of the spirit, the family, and the community. And our broken families, our inability to relate to each other, and our inability to see and envision a future where we can be more harmonious together, especially when our destinies are tied, upholds this terrible system. The verse continues by saying, in work, do what you enjoy. In family life, be completely present. Again, this idea that we start with family, being present with family members. And in work, do what you enjoy. Racism creates deprivation. And in an earlier video, I talked about the overvaluing of possessions and that creating a sense of lack. Lacking, many people end up doing things that does not give them joy. But the Tao prioritizes enjoyment in work. Your life is not meant to be a miserable existence. You're not a worm, and even worms are very happy in rich, delicious, rich soil. And so stand tall and enjoy what it is that you have to do. Enjoy your family, enjoy your life, enjoy your work, and do all of it with pride. And then in the last stanza, which is one of my favorites, we kind of wrap it up. And it says, when you are content to be simply yourself and do not compare or compete, everyone will respect you. And if I have any secret to give you, that's been the secret. Just being simply yourself. And this is the crux of why overesteeming of great men is a problem. Overesteeming is putting someone else on a pedestal. It is having your gaze on someone else's whatever. Deprivation arises from this because overesteeming is thinking that over there, what that other person has is what I need to feel full and complete. You have taken your eyes off your ball, and that has created a sense of deprivation within you. But you have your life, and your life is precious. But because you're overesteeming people and possessions, you develop and cannot shake this sense of having and not having. And for both black and white and everybody in between, there is a great anxiety that comes with humanity where everybody's asking, am I good enough? Am I good enough? You know, one of the things that I often get asked is, why are people in poor countries so much happier, it seems sometimes, than Americans? I think part of the reason is because Americans compete and compare endlessly, and it's a sickness that leads to misery. In a poorer nation, since most people are relatively in the same class, there isn't that sense of lack and deprivation. It's not as pronounced day to day. And so many people are content doing what they have to do to make what they have available produce what they need to live. But in the West, and I'd say specifically in the US, advertising and marketing has become so entrenched in the culture that you end up comparing and competing even when you don't want to. This drops you back into your ego that we talked about in verse 7. And in doing so, you're feeding these ideas of having and not having, and you're feeding this monster of overesteeming great men, whatever or whoever that means. As though wealthy people and beautiful people don't have destabilizing problems of their own. I've met and interacted with very beautiful people. Their spirit is broken in such a devastating way. And they're so dissatisfied with themselves, and it almost doesn't matter how much they have. They move in the world in that dissatisfaction with self. Finally, I'd like to invite you to do an exercise, because when you are trained or accustomed to comparing and competing, it can be really hard to shift and release judgments. But it is possible. And so the first step is to notice and acknowledge that those are judgments that you are passing. You are considering something beautiful. You are considering something ugly. You're considering something smart. You're considering something stupid. You're considering some things this and some things that, something black, something white, saints and sinners, right? When you acknowledge your own judgments that you're passing, you are able to start releasing those judgments, noticing that you're comparing and therefore judging is the first step. Once you do, you can get curious about what that part is within you. And so that's what I want to invite you to do. You've been listening and maybe following along in this video series, and I'm interested to know, what judgments have you been casting upon me? Are you aware of them? Bring them to consciousness. Make them conscious. What judgments have you been making about me? And the moment that you start making those conscious is the moment that you become able to look at them and begin to free yourself. Because yes, you are casting judgments, but where does that need to judge come from? Is that you? And why is it so important to you to judge? What does it do for you to judge? So get curious about that. What messages are you sending to yourself as you're judging? Why do you care so much? And what's the real concern or fear behind that need to compare and compete and pass judgment on other people? What are you trying to protect? It's my observation and belief that judgments often speak more about yourself and your own sense of needs and insecurities than they do about whoever it is that you're casting judgment upon. Because isn't it true that if another person is showing up and they are being present, aren't they simply being themselves? You may not like it, but the fact that you don't like it speaks more to you than it does about the other person. And so explore, and I invite you to write about your judgments now and over the next week and see what you discover about yourself. As I said, verse 8 is one of my favorites because it unveils a lot of missteps that we kind of fall into as humanity. And this verse speaks so clearly about the abundance of goodness and the inbuilt caution against any doctrine that claims to have a monopoly on goodness. It also gives insight on how we can live our life in harmony, in work, being with family, and showing up in conflict. And finally, this much bigger container that's super spacious of simply being content with yourself. Who are you? And are you happy with yourself? How has comparing and being hyper-competitive and passing judgments impacted your relationships with your family and others? How are these tendencies producing outcomes that aren't necessarily what you want or would hope to get? And how might more contentment with yourself and more generosity and fairness and conflict shift the dynamics in your current relationships? I welcome your reflections. And with that, I so thank you very much for joining me today. And I will see you in the next lesson where I will look at verse 9 of the Tao Te Ching.